my own Google Map collection, and I started using Google Maps to plot various sightings or examples. There's about 240 pins or so. It's surprising how many things overlap with the strange and the supernatural, because the police apparently managed to entirely quell this witchcraft racket that was going on. As a result, we have this incredibly vivid image of the witches turning into hares and the streets of Aberystwyth being populated by hares for a short time. And this friend supposedly, and I quote again, was in great terror that this had been heard, and began to say that there was a ghost horse in that field, a headless white horse, a Ceffyl Gwyn, a Welsh white horse. You shouldn't mention its name. Obviously she had, because she was supposedly very unlucky just to mention it.
The ASSAP Paranormal webinars, seriously strange as the moniker says. It's been 5 years. That's right, an incredible 5-year anniversary is just around the corner. Thank you very, very much to everyone who has followed us along on this journey from the very beginning to where we are today. Whether you're a speaker, whether you're a producer, whether you're behind the scenes, whether you're writing, sharing, liking, subscribing, truly thank you very much. Keep it up. But I do have a request from you. The request is very simple. A comment, a review. Now you can comment and review on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple, on Audible. I'd really appreciate it if you could share the content that's available. We have an incredible catalogue available. There's nearly 250 webinar presentations, talks, discussions, special panels and more that are available, freely available to watch and listen. They're available for you. A massive catalogue from truly the best enthusiasts, academics, deep researched individuals who want to share their stories and share the research of the serious side of the paranormal. So again, from ASSAP, from me presenting here, thank you very much. And like Benbough-Jackson coming up.
I hope this will be of interest tonight. It's a slightly different approach than I usually take. It's not so much case study based as more of a survey. To use university speak, it's a survey rather than a specialist kind of module, if you'd use that term for this kind of presentation. It's a journey selecting specific examples from the weird aspects of this county, known as Ceredigion. And as usual, I have a few maps to start with to illustrate, where we are and some of the features of where we are. And before I start, I need also flag up that the Sweet Panic in Manchester 1908 is ready to run, so that will be appearing in the future, hopefully, on this platform. So there we have it, a very helpful map there, indicating where it is in the context of England and Wales itself. As you can see, it is on the western side of the Welsh nation and on the island of Great Britain. The county's name harks back to a 5th century warrior king, Ceredig, and again, one of those Christian warriors who was so much vaunted, of course Arthur being the most well-known of them. It's only been the county name from 1996 that was used much earlier than that, and before then it was part of a super county called Dyfed. I've got to be careful here, I don't go into these county histories, which is another one of my areas of interest. Then it was Cardiganshire previously for the 1970s. And this is where we need to realise it's got 3 names really. The English Cardiganshire, the Welsh equivalent, Shir Aberteifi, and also Ceredigion, which can be used at the same time in the past, even though the official name does change. It's predominantly got considerable coast as you can see here, and it's a rather smooth coast. I think Julian Barnes, the author, described it as a sea lion curve of Cardiganshire. And when you look at Pembrokeshire, it's far more inland, more craggy and more varied, more inlets than this county to the north. It's got quite a few uplands as well in the north of the county, as you can see from Aberystwyth there to the side in the northeast. And to the east in general, you have the Cambrian Mountains, which are not as impressive as Snowdonia, but culturally, they play a vital part in distinguishing the east and west from Wales. The east being more English in language and also in culture, and the west being a bit more Welsh. And indeed, in 2021, the survey of Welsh speakers in the county put them at 45% of the population. It is a very Welsh county, particularly in the context of South Wales, along the western part there. The by Ceredigion, of course, is Cardigan Bay, and as you can see, the main settlements are indicated there. Some of them are just the other side of the county. Llanybydder, where I spent over 30 years of my life, is highlighted there for some reason. Not that it didn't deserve it, but there it is. The geology, the geological characteristics, again, it's fairly old rocks, Silurian or Ordovician, but there's not as much variety as you have in North Pembrokeshire or to the north in Merionethshire, and then further into Carnarvonshire, where you have Snowdonia and the like. So it's got two main types there from that probably simplistic geological map. And this map is, you may recognize it from the Montagna collection of folklore and superstition map. I find this quite interesting. It's up on the wall in my office, and I've decided to zoom into the Cardiganshire, the Ceredigion part. I may slip between the two at times, as is typical and as explained. To be honest, it doesn't give the county as much credit for the strange as it could do, even though it does highlight some of the big names here, which are Pantra Gwaelod, the Welsh Atlantis as it's described, which does run further up, but it is predominantly associated with that part of Cardigan Bay. Devil's Bridge, of which many of you will be familiar with, the Nantios Cup, Llyn Eiddwen, which again has a legend attached to it that when it dries up, the town of Carmarthen, which is in the county to the south, will disappear or fall. It's not a bad representation, but it's not half as thorough as it could be. And so I won't be mentioning many of these, if any of these, examples, as enticing as some of them are to look into, because I want to focus on this instead. And prepare yourselves, you better might need some sunglasses for this. Yeah, this is my own Google Map collection. And I started using Google Maps to plot various sightings or examples when I was doing my Sea Monsters article, as mentioned by Kristian, and that has been published now. It's available free, accessible online through the university, as is our open access policy. I think it's a journal based on the Coastal Society, and so I hope that'll be of interest to some people. May want to look into that later on. So I decided to use it for this as well, for this purpose. So I began putting these pins in. This isn't the active map. I'm not brave enough to put that up on the screen and confuse myself all the more. But you zoom in and it becomes a little bit clearer in part. There's about 240 pins or so that I've placed. I've just put a couple in earlier, and I am going to brave myself. And when Kristian mentioned the Seriously Strange magazine having people's stories and the like, I thought, that'd be great, wouldn't it, for me to put a request out for people to mention the stories related to those people living in or around the county. That's a good idea. I may well start to do, because I'm beginning to run out of what I've been, the sources that I've been using so far. I've been using English language sources, Welsh language sources. I've been using collections of folklore, of which there's a fair few, as well as searching in the publications of the newspapers. So from the 250, I've selected about 12 tonight, but I'm going to speak around them a little. So probably I'll reach 25. So 10% really of what I've done so far will be used, of what I've looked into so far. As I said, this is a survey. I haven't done a particular study on any of these, though it's hard and you pull yourself back sometimes. The main aim has been to provide a comprehensive coverage of the county itself, north and south, because it has got north-south divide, where it hasn't, but also to provide a coverage of different themes, such as those addressed by ASSAP. So as well as the cryptozoological elements, I've got a fair amount of, well, you could call it sci in terms of the witches and the wizards and so forth, some standing stones as well as many other things. So that is one of my current projects. So I thought I'd better put it to use and bring it to people's notice about what's been going on. And what I found was there's a surprisingly wide range of phenomena here, that there are certain concentrations chronologically and geographically, and they overlap the county as well, because the supernatural doesn't respect county boundaries or national ones. But I always think that, well, that may well be the case. However, we live in these, some would say artificially created, others wouldn't, situations, and the supernatural does kind of fit in. So I've gone a bit to the south at times, to northern Carmarthenshire, not that far, because I wanted to be as true to the county boundary as possible, and also to the east, along those mountainous areas which run into other counties. This survey is intended to highlight some important aspects. So I've put down here what I've said. I'm going to be looking at sources, spooks, psi, stones, and critters. That kind of, I didn't really put an S equivalent there for critters, but that's the range of things that are going to be recorded. It was a wild experience putting this together in terms of psychological journeys through these source materials. And it was a great opportunity as well, because I did get to dive a bit deeper. I had to pull myself back sometimes, but there were times when I thought I was slipping into a case study approach, such as what researchers do. For each one, I'm going to describe it briefly and as best as I can, as best as possible. Then I'm going to just make an observation about its significance in terms of the study of the supernatural in general, and whether as a social science or humanities approach, whatever's taken. And I'll try sometimes to add a bit of make-believe in, to try to create a bit of a weave a story around. I may leave that aside tonight, actually, because as interesting as it was for me to visualize this journey, perhaps it'll get a little bit too weird, to be honest, if I start trying to create a fiction around this, as well as the events themselves or the reports themselves, which of course have their own sense of wonder. So just I'm kind of pulling myself back there a little bit and reining in my enthusiasm. But some of this is seen in this itinerary that I put together. We've already departed reality, as you can see, and we're going to be starting with some fairies, and we'll be starting in London. And there's a reason for that. Each one will have a connection to Ceredigion. Every county is connected to London in some ways, but there is quite a strong connection of that county with London, as there was about this milk, for example, setting up dairies in London often could frequently have people from that county were involved in it, as well as London being seen as a place where fortunes could be made for many of the people in what is really, I suppose, or has been a very poor county, with lots of land which isn't particularly fertile beyond the valleys itself, beyond the river valleys, I mean. Then we'll be going to see the mermaids, more fairies, a dragon of sorts, that poltergeist in Lampeter, which was also quite musical. Going to the next river valley, I've used the river valleys as a structure here, definitely going to focus on some strange flying objects. Then ghosts and more magical goings on with the Ystrith Valley, the Radol Valley, the final one, more witches, more cunning folk going on there. Then we bring in our big cats and some strange stones before concluding, and it was mentioned a few weeks ago by Kristian, with Cleopatra's Needle in London, the London one. And then we're back to reality for any comments or questions. Okay, so that building is the north. It's the Hilton now. It's the kind of Western Railway building, the Great Western Hotel, and that's where this eccentric cardigan colonel was staying when he had. It seemed to be a very strange experience, explained in this account, which is a police court account. And these are fascinating sources. There are the lowest levels of the courts for dealing with disruptive individuals or minor issues. but the stories that emerge from them are often quite incredible. Now, this happened in 1890. He was in his hotel room. He'd been seen by a doctor previously for epilepsy. And after that, 4 days or so, he went on a bit of a rampage and tried to break into a house nearby. And one of the things that he said he was experiencing was harassment by fairies. Fairies were chasing him. Now, unfortunately, the amount of detail is limited here. What kind of fairies? What do they look like? All the things that we'd like to know aren't given in this police account. And often with police courts, the details, when I've looked at documents related to another case in London from a police court, are pretty sketchy. They don't really provide as much beyond the statement of what happened, of who the individual was. So these fairies, we just leave them be as fairies. He got off quite lightly from this. It wasn't a major offence, and obviously there's a medical reason. As well as the epilepsy, he had sunstroke on 2 occasions while serving in India with the Royal Engineers. And so effectively he was told that if your family will look after you, then there's no worries, you won't be charged with anything. Now, I hop on the census because one of the good things with these cases from around decade or the turn of the decade is it's a little bit easier to catch you with a name and to trace where people were immediately afterwards or thereabouts. And indeed, he does end up with his family in Llancoed Moor, just outside Cardigan. And I discovered when looking at the census that his father was the Archdeacon of Cardigan as well. So this man was not a nobody, and his family probably had the means to look after him. One of the comments you can't see there in that account is that he was quite a strong man, and they needed at least 2 average-sized men to kind of control him. So yeah, those fairies really had got to this individual. And the general point to draw out of this is, well, this man had served in India, obviously, for some time, and I can't help wondering whether these fairies had were they Western fairies, or were they something a bit, more kind of exotic, you could argue, in some ways? Was this related to some kind of trauma as well as perhaps a physical cause? It always the overlap between physical illness and obviously psychological illness and the supernatural is fascinating. Now, I don't mean that immediately to dismiss this as all hallucinations. If you were taking a hard believer line, which you could, you may well see these ailments as ways of accessing these other realms and other beings. I do think it's always worth thinking about the medical side when we look at these occasions. And he was obviously very ill. Back he goes to West Wales, which really wasn't the best place for somebody who was prone to seeing and experiencing the supernatural. Not that any place is. Because when you go back to West Wales, you've got a strong tradition along the coast here of mermaids, for one thing, which maybe not as scary as fairies for the Colonel, they were talked about. And even though by 1923, which is where I got that image from, and that's not a particular image of a mermaid sighting, because in 1923 there was a centenary acknowledgement of one of the most well-documented mermaid sightings in Wales, and definitely in Cardiganshire, Ceredigion. It happened in the north of the county, and it was published in Welsh initially in 1823. Now, this story, which I'm not going to go into in detail because it's in the north and we've got other things to look at there, but it does reflect a strong association. For one thing, there's an account of the Cardiganshire contingent in Agincourt in 1415 having a banner with a mermaid on the rock. And that was recounted in the poem by Michael Drayton in 1627. That image there is supposedly of the old town seal of Cardigan. The mermaids and the tradition of the mermaid even exists when it comes to the 10-mile rowing race that goes on today around the estuary and an island before coming back again, called the Mermaid Race. I really am disappointed by the current county arms, which I haven't put up there, of Cardiganshire. They've got mackerel on them and some wheat sheaves. And, as much as I like mackerel and wheat, pretty important, kind of miss that earlier mermaid feel. It would give it a bit more of an exciting image there for the county. Perhaps there were reasons for that. Who knows? Perhaps it was seen as a little bit too supernatural, maybe, for that purpose. Instead we get that very functional one, which we have today. I suppose you could see that mermaid is not half as famous as the DNS, for example, which Simon Young's going to be writing about, publishing work on it soon. That was in the 1890s. This one of 1823 was quite a bit earlier, and I don't think there's been any mere men being spotted, and that's interesting in itself. When it comes to the mere folk and aquatic creatures, I like to think about, well, which coasts do they appear on most commonly? When I was doing the sea monsters in Interwar Britain and Ireland, it tended, not exclusively of course, but to collection on the east side of England, and there were various reasons for that. To many other places too, some incredible ones. And when it comes to mermaids, and again I'm going to the work of Simon Young here, and there seems to be a more Western emphasis with that mermaid population or sightings in the past, and it's always interesting to plot things and see where they pan out and then try and wonder what possible reasons could account for that. On the right you can see Cardigan, or part of Cardigan town. Now this is the problem with William Brown coming back to Cardigan, or coming nearby to Cardigan, is that there's a story of the Plant Rhys Dyffryn, the children of Rhys the Deep. Now, like fairy folk, they can't be seen, and then they can be seen, and they would never be seen travelling to the market, but when they were in the market, you could spot them, and then when they went back, well, you couldn't see them leave. The problem with these particular fairies was that they would buy the corn in the market at the asking price. Now, that would keep the price high. They were adored by the farmers or those selling corn. Other members of the population weren't so happy, because if there was a high demand, the price could be kept high, and they themselves would not get corn at a more affordable rate. And when I first read this, it was a number of years ago when I read about this account, and I think there are similar ones elsewhere, but it's quite a detailed one. It struck me that economics as well as medicine and other matters overlap with the supernatural. This does seem like a account of, well, if not class conflict, then diverging influences, and why the fairies come into it is another matter altogether. But it does remind us that economics is often seen as quite a dry subject, but there's a lot to it. And when you see it in this case, you really got a good example of that old book, remember, Freakonomics from a few years ago, of a great example of that happening in a supernatural sense. It's surprising how many things overlap with the strange and the supernatural. So yes, let's go up the Teifi Valley. It's the longest river in the county. It's the border with Carmarthenshire primarily, and it's not going to be done in any way, any justice by what I'm going to focus on, but I have chosen two of the most notable supernatural or unusual features here. And I suppose this is cryptozoology with the first one, the Gwyber of Newcastle Emlyn. I haven't really cheated here, but Newcastle Emlyn straddles the valley, as indeed most of the towns do. So it's in Carmarthenshire and Cardiganshire, Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire. Gwyber is the Welsh word for viper. It's used to describe that snake, but it also has a meaning of a flying serpent, some of which more dragon-like than others. This is a recent depiction of it, doing the Ouroboros and eating its tail. Unfortunately, the one that is rumoured to have visited Newcastle Emlyn as recently as the 18th century, according to what I read. Again, a very, very unclear as regards dates, but the accounts from 1870 and earlier tend to think it happened in the 1700s, which makes it fairly recent for a dragon sighting, even though I have read of some very more recent ones of late. It's just to put it in short, this animal flew over on Fair Day, again another day of trade and activity like that. It landed on a castle which has been destroyed during the Civil War, not destroyed, damaged severely during the Civil War, and began to threaten or pose a threat. And its body was armoured apart from around its navel. This is a classic case of, a little point which had to be hit by somebody who was a very good shot. Now, apparently an older soldier was there, and they managed somehow to hit that point. The Gwyber landed in the river and floated away. It wasn't dead, but apparently, yeah, it was injured. People were warned not to drink anything from the river for a long time, which is interesting because it flows that way, and you'd think that all the venom which supposedly comes from it would have, just gone down and poisoned everyone in Cardigan, but that was the advice that was given. This story's been going for a long time, and the town itself hasn't made much of this event at all. It's not become like a Mothman equivalent by any extent. There's no statue or anything there. And looking at some of the Welsh language periodicals in the 1870s, there's discussion about what this could be, and what you get here is something that you'd have today, really, when people try to understand what actually something was. There's discussions that it could have been a very strange bird. One man says that his mother believed in it. She wasn't a witness, but she believed in it, even though she had no belief in ghosts or fairies, but this was something else. And I saw there a little reflection, I suppose, today we have between those who distinguish between the flesh and blood type creatures and those of other varieties of the strange. It really is an intriguing case, deserves a lot more attention. I'm glad I've just brought it there. On the map I saw showed at the start, the Muntianania map, don't mention it's a changeling, but really think the Gwyber or the Flying Dragon deserves a place, as indeed does the Lampeter poltergeist, because this is something which isn't really that well known. I spent, as I said, about 30 years nearby, and nothing was said to me about this. I passed that very building on numerous occasions when I went to secondary school there. Nobody mentioned about this haunting in early 1905 to me whatsoever. It is well documented. Indeed, Charles Fort in Low mentions this case. In that chapter where he talks about that peculiar winter of 1904-05, which is a fascinating study in the variety of the strange, but also an interesting investigation of how Fort himself structures the strange and offers his opinions about it. It does stand out in considerable detail. Now, I realise time is going on, and I'm only in the first valley. This may need a part 2 down the line, but I'll just explain now. The Lampeter ghost, responsive ghost as it was called at the time, responded to knocks. It tapped out songs, including popular songs of the day, such as a song called Bill Bailey, which was the product of an American musician. It also moved the bed, particularly of the youngest of 3 boys who lived there, called Jackie. He was 11 years old and seemed to be the main focus for this being. It moved the chairs, shook the bed. The individual who lived there and his family was quite well respected. He was a he was a solicitor, including the registrar of the county court at Lampeter, and various other positions of influence, like the clerk for the Tyvee fishing board. And, the River Tyvee is really well known for its fish. Jimmy Carter fished there once. A very notable individual, Bishop of Swansea, went there to investigate it, as indeed did some academics from what was then, is no longer, the college at Lampeter. It got a lot of attention. Now, I've got my own ideas about how this and why this spread and became so well known. It's not the place to talk about them now, but I just wanted to let you know that this was, we could call it a poltergeist in many respects. I don't think anything lifted off the ground, and there were many other elements that appeared. It did have some ghostly aspects in terms of a woman in dark clothes. But as I said, what is so great about this is the documentation. We know the names of the servants who worked there. Indeed, Jackie, the young boy, had to move to the servant's mother's house for a while in order for them to see what happened. The Lampeter ghost, it really needs to be brought back from the dead, and maybe the university will be too in some time. I'm not sure about that, though. The Aeron Valley, which is to the north of Lampeter, kind of like the middle of Ceredigion, really, it's not the only place where there are UFOs. Those of you who have heard of Mark Ollie's documentary based on the 1983, as he described it as the European Roswell, happens in Llanila, further to the north. That image there, that photograph from 2002, 2 was taken in Llanrhystr, which is just above Aberarth, between Aberaeron and Aberystwyth. I've included it there because it's the only photographic evidence I could find. You'd find it online and discussions about it online. I'm not going to attempt an analysis here. It's not an area of my expertise at all, but I leave it there for you to have a look at and think about. The person who took that photograph commented on how much it looked like a flying saucer. And when you think about how we go through these changes in names and terms used for these objects and sightings in the sky, that was quite a retro one, I thought to myself when I heard it and when I looked into it. The one I want to focus on comes from 70 years earlier, which is the Mydroelyn. You can see at the bottom there next to the hammer. That represents a weird, like, poltergeist-like activity. Again, I'm overlooking that briefly, but Mydroelyn UFO happened in 1950, again, early days, really, of the whole reporting of such things. It got serious coverage in the local press. It wasn't sensationalized as much as I expected it to be. There was a reference to the American versions, but this 57-year-old woman who lived on a small holding on her own was given a great deal of respect in the report. She had just been out shopping. It was November 1950, around 7 p.m. That image there, sorry, jumping with my times, was taken after 10 o'clock, according to the witness. But this was after 7 p.m. and she was going to milk her goats, and you couldn't get more Ceredigion at that time than going to milk your goats. She looked up in the sky and quote, and it feels amazing, doesn't it, to be quoting somebody from 1950, or this other newspaper reported it. She said, "It was the queerest thing I have ever seen in my life." It was described as having no flames. It didn't have a tail. And intriguingly, the reporter says, unlike other reports, so that, there's no other reports in the press that I can find. So it makes me think, well, maybe, obviously he's hearing people say things, and maybe some say there might have been a tail. It really does just invite further investigation, maybe frustratingly given the lack of information. Her observations were given a great deal of credence, as I said, because she worked often under the stars and she was aware of, what the stars were and the like. What really strikes me about these two cases is that they both refer to, they're both called flying saucers. And I'm not putting a case for continuity here, but I do think sometimes the changes that happen, undoubtedly happen, are accompanied by some continuities, if only in the terms that are used to describe them. I can't stop there, though. Aberarth, as you can see to the north of the map on the right, there we have Gavin Gibbon's account, The Coming of the Spaceships. He records a bright object entering the sea in 1955. Ciliaeron, which is just to the side there. There are sightings there from 2018 and 2023. An individual called Helena Worth saw some orb-like, and she thinks that they are related to the animal mutilations that happen around that area, particularly the sheep mutilations. All very intriguing and a reminder of how these kind of things overlap in many people's eyes. I honestly think that these sightings haven't been given as much attention, perhaps, as they deserve to be, because of the more well-known Pembrokeshire incidents, which of course deserve all the attention they get, Broadhaven and so forth. I know we didn't have children there witnessing a landing, but we did have at least a woman who milked goats seeing them, which I think is quite interesting in itself. Apologies for my inept attempt to conceal that horse's head, but when we go to the Ystyryth Valley, which is to the north, just below Aberystwyth, as expected, there's two rivers run next to Aberystwyth. It gets its name from the one just to the south of it, the Ystwyth. But it's a headless horse, a headless white horse, and is found just outside Aberystwyth, along the side of the Ystwyth, at Llanfarian. And it's a tale which is intriguing again because it comes from a collection of 1920s folklore, which was a time when there was much effort to catalogue. There was a project with schools where children were asked to collect folklore from their vicinity, which is in the University of Wales and also in the National Library of Wales, which I need to consult. That'd be really useful. But some of it was published, almost like a side project where adults were asked, and some of these adults who came forward provided fascinating tales that comprise at least a couple of cases here. So this one involves the witness walking through a field and hearing a horse snorting, and there's nothing in the field. And what's interesting is here the individual putting this together says, well, in Switzerland there are cases where people hear cows and there aren't any because of the echoing effect. And once again, as well as studying these strange phenomena, looking at them, I like to look at the explanations that are given. It's not a particularly mountainous area, this part, so it doesn't really apply there, but nonetheless, it was the attempt to explain. It really troubled this auditory witness because she went and asked a friend, and this friend supposedly, and I quote again, was in great terror that this had been heard, and began to say that there was a ghost horse in that field, a headless white horse, a Ceffyl Gwyn, a Welsh white horse. You shouldn't mention its name. Obviously she had, because she was supposedly very unlucky just to mention it. And it's surprising because in Llanfarian as well, just nearby, you also have these tales of the white cattle. And the witness here is quite wily because they say, well, I just buy white cattle all the time because they're so cheap, because no one wants to buy them. And he even mentions how much cheaper they are compared to the ordinary cattle. Again, the association with fairies is given. This general belief in bad luck of these white animals. And we usually associate darkness with misfortune, don't we? And this is the whole interesting kind of dynamic between black and white that goes on here. But we're definitely in Llanfarian getting the feeling that the white animals are the ones that don't bode well in one way or the other. I do feel sorry for that headless horse, not only because I've completely messed it up with my attempt at concealing its head, but how could it snort and so forth out there? It really is a surprise. I just want to say that the UFOs have no role in that horse's mutilation. I think it had already been a headless white horse for some time. So moving up the valley, and it's a long winding river, not particularly wide, not like the Teifi, but it takes us further east because many of the rivers in this county run down the Cambrian hills and Cambrian mountains towards Cardigan Bay. This is a real cracker because we enter some early, 1780, that publication came out by Edmund Jones. It's very well known by anyone who would wants to study the strange in Wales and elsewhere, a relation of the apparitions of spirits and so forth. It talks about wizards. And the one I want to talk about here is called Dafydd Llwyd. Now, Dafydd Llwyd ranged widely. He was around, he wasn't just around Ysbyty Ystwyth, where many of the stories come from. The name Ysbyty means hospital, and that's because it was the property of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, as many places were in the wilds of Cardiganshire in the past, the wilds of Ceredigion. Again, I'm using both terms. Dafydd Llwyd's identity is a bit convoluted and confused. I just want to focus on the story here because it is a great example of the sorcerer's apprentice type tale, as popularized, of course, with Fantasia by Disney. Meant to be active in the 17th century, Dafydd Llwyd had incredible magical powers. He had this spell book which he carried with him, and in the book was contained this spirit which did his bidding, which somehow he'd managed to control and contain in this book. Now, as he's doing his rounds, because it sounds like he was basically going from house to house, he left his book a few houses back and sent his apprentice because he required it for this particular operation. Now, you can kind of guess what happens. The apprentice makes the mistake of opening the book as he's walking back to meet his master, and lo and behold, the spirit comes out and says, "What can I do for you?" Now, the young boy is quicker. He's not particularly naive, but wants the spirit to do something so his master can make it back. So he asks that it takes out all the stones from the River Ystwyth, and it succeeds in doing that rapidly and quite alarmingly. Then the boy says, put them back in to bide a bit more time. And eventually Dafydd Llwyd comes back, puts it back in the book, and they can continue, no doubt telling his apprentice off. It really is one of many, and indeed there's quite a strong theme of witchcraft and so forth that comes through in this collection. The history of Ceridicion's folk tales and supernatural rests on the southwest at times around Cardigan, where the Goidelic influence rather than the Brythonic influence of Celtic language is seen, and that's explained by Irish influences or perhaps Irish settlement in that area. But in the 1930s, about a decade afterwards, there's more work done in the north of the county, and the mountainous areas gained a reputation too for these persistent beliefs and also the old origins of these beliefs. Dafydd Llwyd apparently challenged another wizard from the south near Lampeter to a battle. Yes, it really gets all quite Harry Potter when you look into that. So just short hop really to the other neighbouring river, the Rheidol, known famously for having a train that goes up it still, a scenic tourist train. But here we are in Aberystwyth proper. Aberystwyth should be called Aberrheidol, really, but because the Ystwyth is not in the middle of the town. And we have, it's a very significant town. It's probably the largest. It is the largest town, even though it's not the county town of Ceredigion. That hence one of those tensions between the north and south there, between those two places. It has a reputation for witchcraft, though, that again I was not aware of until I started reading about it. And it's surprising. It's a town, for one thing. And this whole debate about, this whole idea about witchcraft and wizardry being more of a rural phenomena, well, it seems to be both. I mean, the work of Carl Bell and his look into urban magical mentalities in the 19th century, it does seem to have a considerable amount of support when you look into it, and particularly up to a point. And this is illustrated by this story. And as you can imagine, those hairs are witches, or the witches change into them, which is quite a common theme, of course. So there's a tale that the town was overrun by witches in the early 19th century. They could get anything they wanted from anybody. They would threaten someone, or just the fact that they could give you the evil eye meant that people would just, take anything you want to. Sounds quite lawless. Sounds very Wild West. But things changed. And they changed after the arrival of what were called the new police. And we usually associate these with Robert Peel, 1829. And of course, the organised police forces were rolled out, or not that they was that organised, but they did appear in various places. And I saw that the Aberystwyth Police Force was formed in 1850 and then merged with the Cardiganshire Constabulary in 1857. So we're talking about a mid-19th century turning point here. And as soon as I read that, I thought Owen Davies and his article on the press and his other work on witchcraft, he definitely comes down on this approximately mid-19th century shift. And it's more than just a shift in policing presence. It's more about a shift of demographics as Britain becomes more urban than rural, as according to the 1851 census, where it becomes approximately equal, as well as many other changes that are taking place then in all such things that, according to Davis, impact our understanding of what witchcraft was. There was more reliance on food from further afield rather than being made nearby, and that would of course continue all the way to the end of the 19th century, the 1880s, with our refrigerated meat from Argentina and the antipodes, of course. So in some ways, the provision of local food was less prone to interference by witchcraft, or the fear of interference by witchcraft. There seemed to be a lot of forces at work around that point. But I want to get back to the police, because the police apparently managed to entirely quell this witchcraft racket that was going on. As a result, we have this incredibly vivid image of the witches turning into hares and the streets of Aberystwyth being populated by hares for a short time. A very, very rural animal in the market town situation. Once again, I like to flag up this idea of relationship between the law and the supernatural, which is a very close relationship, often conflicting and very tense as to what was and what is allowed and how it is policed, literally in this case. Going up another long valley, which takes us to mining areas, lots of lead mining, lots of knockers, lots of strange mining stories there, which I'm not going to touch on because I'm looking into hauntings of mines as well as another project at the moment. Witches and cunning men. The cunning men and cunning folk are all around, often profiting on people's fear of curses and trying to solve illnesses. And I've chosen a graveyard there in a town, very small, it's not even a town really, of Ystumtwyn. Ystumtwyn is a very isolated spot, high up in the uplands, where in 1839, a mother was very concerned about her son. He was a young adult, he was very ill. So she consulted a cunning man. The cunning man had a wonderful idea on how to cure this young boy, this young man. You need to take off his trousers. Okay, don't worry, it's not getting that way. And stick them in the ground. Bury them. And he will recover. So, as you can imagine, the boy died. And the mother was obviously mourning and very sad. And the cunning man clearly tried his best with this incredible method of curing someone who's ill. Maybe we should start doing it these days. Just bury your trousers in the garden. Now, Aberystwyth, which is about 11 miles down the valley, has this market and people come there from all around. And the mother is there one day and she sees the cunning man on the high street and you guess what? He's wearing the son's trousers. And what follows is a public scene as she accosts him and people gather round and take her side. All of this reported in the newspaper as an example of Cambrian credulity, as they say. A wonderful source. And again, a little inkling there of 1839 troubles, and also the centrality of these market towns for people meeting, maybe tensions coming to the fore, trade to be made, people to be tricked. It's it's a very exciting environment to be in at the time. And one where the beliefs of those outside the area could be exposed. It's quite interesting to put these two together because around about that time when that man was accosted in Aberystwyth, it was also a place where supposedly these witches were having carte blanche to get whatever they want. So we need to head back now, slowly, gradually, and what we'll do is we'll follow that black line on the left, which is the Big Cat Alley, the route taken, according to one police official, police officer, who responded to some incidents involving mutilated sheep. And when we say mutilated, of course, there's a whole scale, because you can be mutilated, unfortunately, in many ways, can't you? There's those kind of precise mutilations which we think involve technology that may even be beyond our ability to create, to more butchered mutilations. And of course, we're into the problems of how we can actually gauge and assess the decay of carcasses. Samantha Hearn at the University of Wales, Lampeter, again, rest in peace, Lampeter. She is an anthropologist who's done some incredible investigations into the perceptions and understandings of these events in this immediate area around the Cambrian Mountains. But let's take a deep breath and start taking this journey along this route, which was recorded as the Big Cat Corridor. It takes them from the Brechfa Forest, which is just behind me here as I speak, actually. I might get to see an ABC before nightfall, which is down in the south. Don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, it's in the south. And they travel up. In the winter, they're in the Brechfa Forest, and in the summer, they move up to woodland areas just behind Devil's Bridge. So they're there for the summer. Now, this 35-mile route is given as the explanation for the amount of sightings and mutilations that take place. Now, I was growing up in that other place, which is quite close to Brechfa, and it was the Brechfa Beast. But there's also the Beast of Bont, which is further to the north, which is there as I've appropriately chosen a lion image. And in 1981, in June, vets from the Ministry of Agriculture established this as being killed by an animal which is a great deal more powerful than a dog or a fox or a badger, those kind of big things, if you can call them big, that we have now. There are other cases, as you can see on the map there, of lion heads that have stuck around in different colours. Some of these are a bit stranger in terms of having their stomachs cut open and supposedly just their hearts removed, which isn't exactly the kind of surgical precision we expect from the classic alien into animal mutilation, but it is slightly stranger than, obviously an animal being mangled. Now, I have gone into some interesting cases, one of which from Ireland, that deserves its own investigation, of strange kind of blood-sucking phenomenon. Of course, that's often associated with the loss of blood. I haven't looked into every case in Ceredigion. There may be some more of that nature. The sighting of big cats is fairly common in the area as well, Cilia Aeron onwards. So as you can see there, it doesn't really fit into the cat corridor theory when we look at the sightings that are further to the west. Nonetheless, it's an interesting one and may still hold true. They may just go off on the side for a bit, and maybe the sheep are bigger or more tempting that side. I don't know. It's interesting, though. I think it's just a coincidence that this is also the area which is a rough border between counties. The standing stones that you can see there on the left as well as on the right. I've just chosen one image for those anyway. Not just standing stones, but also old hill forts and the like. Prehistoric monuments. The one on the right you can see is called the Long Stone, and that is marking the old border between Ceredigion and Carmarthen. It's about 16 foot tall. It's basically in the middle of nowhere, but there's a lot of nowhere around that part of there. It's called the Green Desert by many. It's very, very sparsely populated today, and it was in the past as well. It's the Carreg Hirfaen, as it's called. I love looking back at the different descriptions of this. A monster monolith, somebody said recently. And then way back in the 1840s, someone called it a conspicuous colossus. There's not much folklore about it that I could find, unlike some other stones in the area, no fairy abductions or so on. But it is a very impressive presence, and it was accompanied by the small stone, which was only a foot shorter at 15 or so feet, according to some records. A very intriguing pairing there. And I said I'd end with London, because you've got another stone there. The obelisk, of course, known Cleopatra's Needle, though of course it was long predated Cleopatra. I got some photographs of supposedly the most beautiful Britain women in England as well, buried in the time capsule there. Very intriguing decision. Lots of strangeness about that, including ghosts jumping into the river and so forth. But what I want to bring to the table today, and I'm ending on a big one, really, I've built up to this, is a very strange story that once again I spent a bit too much time last night trying to find out a bit more about this, but I'm just going to tell it as it is. So this involves the granddaughter of a witch that lived in Aberystwyth. She was probably one of those hares. And this witch was called Ginny Wickham. Ginny Wickham was a very unpopular, but she came from a respected family, which kind of goes against the usual witch story. Fascinating in itself. She was well known for cursing a 9-year-old child, which kind of, that's like, not a nice witch. The father of the child threatened her with a gun, and that's a story in itself. But we're going to a granddaughter who's mysteriously called Mrs. J. So unfortunately, this account from the 1920s is very cautious in identifying this individual, which really irritated me, because it means I'm going to have to do more work if I want to look into this, and I'm trying not to get sucked into another project of this magnitude of searching out who this individual was. She died in 1923, according to this account. So I've got Mrs. J in 1923 as a death date. Supposedly, Mrs. J claimed to have played, well, before that, Mrs. J was very good at cursing too. Okay, she effectively murdered a judge who had the audacity to convict her husband and then she also killed her auntie's husband. So yeah, a very good track record, hit rate with cursing. But this is the mysterious thing. She said, or she claimed, that this obelisk, which was gifted way back in 1817 and was erected in 1878, that she'd had a crucial part in its transportation. Now, we know the names of the individuals usually associated with assisting in this transportation. And Mrs. J is not among them. I'll quote what was said, or what she's supposed to have said. She told us that it was she who instructed the authorities as to the proper method of bringing Cleopatra's Needle to London, a feat for which, but for her, they would never have been able to perform. My jaw kind of moved down towards the ground when I heard that, because again, we know that, it wasn't a particularly... There was a bit of a problem when it went into the water in the Bay of Biscay, wasn't it? And again, the individuals who were involved in the whole transportation of Cleopatra's Needle, the design of that, John Dixon's ship and Erasmus Wilson, these were not people who were, I'm looking at this here, they were not the ones who were involved. So what part does this Mrs. J play? Now, I've had a cursory investigation of female Egyptologists. It's ongoing. No obvious hits as yet. How does this all come together? The granddaughter of a renowned witch in the Aberystwyth area supposedly plays a part, and it's not really said here, the proper method. What is meant by that? If only we knew more. And I did say that maybe, we could question this method if, as we know, the problematics with this, its supposed curse and so forth. I don't know if it's got anything to do with that. Do we question the validity of this story? Of course. But would you dare, given her record of cursing? I would be very hesitant to question it. Maybe I shouldn't look into it to disprove it. Maybe I should just let it stand like the obelisks as they are. So I'd just like to thank you all for choosing Capital and Ceredigion Weird Tour Company. It's only been running since 2025, and any feedback on our present tour is more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you indeed very, very much. I was fully infused and enthralled by your presentation and your journey around the weird Ceredigion tour. So thank you very much for your trip and your guidance today. You've took us along many different paths and stories that have taken us everywhere. So absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure those who are here live have got to learn lots of accounts that perhaps have gone under the radar, as you said. And they're the accounts that I find the most tantalizing. Those ones that are almost more rural, those ones that have a link to their community, as well as the more popular ones. And I find that there's something more tangible about them, because they are kind of remembered culturally by the people who live in that location, and why they are so important. It's because those people in those areas haven't chose to spread the message, but they've chose to keep it important and keep it alive for so long. And those accounts go back hundreds and hundreds of years sometimes. So I always find that so fascinating. So thank you very much once again. Oh man, so when did you start collecting stories? When was that an active pursuit of yours?
Well, I think started like consciously collecting for this purpose as a side project for my PhD, and that was on the image of the county more generally. So I was, part of that was this element, but I started like building more and more. And then with the advent of the digital archives, that was a transformation for me, and my own little paper collections became wider and broader. And I learned to search in more different ways, use more words, like, get the old thesaurus out, look for words that mean the same thing and similar things to like look for different events. And yes, and on it goes really. And it just goes from there. Yeah.
Well, there was a certain point where you mentioned Mark Ollie there. He's a gentleman I've known very, very well. He's given many talks here where I live in Nottingham a number of times. And he always says about the beauty of that particular valley. And there's so many accounts there that, you could spend an encyclopedia just gathering them. So the fact that you were there bringing those collections and stories forward is brilliant.
Well, when I saw Llanila mentioned by Ollie, I thought, well, that place has got a lot. I didn't focus on it tonight, but it's got a lot of other things going on there. And indeed, one of the county's most famous folklorists, John Craddock Jones, came from there. So, yeah.
Wait, so what do you think is kind of the driving factor of that area being so weird?
I'm always hesitant to give it any primacy, but I think you definitely could say that it's relative isolation is one factor. I think, because those mountains in the east, make them sound like the Pyrenees. They're not, but they have provided a very significant dividing line, and some would say buffer. And the wilderness and the uplands play a part there too. It is definitely a out of the way, relatively speaking, part of Wales.
Obviously, I haven't visited that part of the world, but I used to go to school with a guy called Mark. I knew him from when I was about 7 years old, and he came from Martin Bay, and he would go there every year, and he would always tell me stories from that age, from like 7, 8 years old, of like ghost stories, or the mermaid actually was one he would brought up quite often. At 7, 8 years old, he said, "Oh, there was a mermaid in the as kids do that. It was out, and he saw that. That was just like fascinating to learn that." So, but talking of mermaids, what do you think people are seeing out in the sea when they see a mermaid, or they are, I hate to use the word imagine. If they are describing a mermaid or a being that is in the water that has the ability to talk to humans, or they're just dashing or playing about, what do you think they're actually seeing?
Yeah. Well, we really are in dangerous waters here, literally, aren't we? Because we don't want to patronize people who work or lived so close to the water. I know with the whole sea serpent thing, it's like, well, maybe sailors weren't that aware anyway of different kinds of aquatic creatures. Well, can we do the same for the fishermen? I don't know. And the others, I can say it's all seals, folks, and leave it at that, or porpoises at most. It really is strange. Seals with seaweed on their hair, and that on their heads, that kind of explanation as well. The case that I touched on was quite vivid. I mean, I can't recall entirely now because it's not part of what I've got here, but it was a sighting rather than a communication with one, with the people on land and the mermaid on a rock. Yeah.
That's an interesting thought, is it? I think there's more mermaid accounts by people who are on land as opposed to at sea.
I think they would I mean, I think the DNS one is quite on land very often, isn't it? When people start looking out, isn't it? Yeah, that is an interesting thought. Because we talk about the coastal division I mentioned, but what about the aquatic versus terrestrial kind of mermaid spotting that goes on? The classic image, you know, a fisherman pulling one up on his net. That's like the legend side. But then there's the legends on the one hand, and then you've got the witnesses on the other, haven't you? Which is an interesting question, yeah.
Of course, you have these stories going back to like Odysseus, of course, lost at sea in the Mediterranean. You know, when he comes across the sirens, as it were, and obviously he, in order to prevent his crew from jumping overboard into the water, he fastens them all to the mast and to the ground, and he covers their ears. But he himself just fastens himself to the mast, but doesn't cover his ears, so he can hear the beautiful song. I mean, I find that account to be what is he really describing there?
Yes.
We now know that Troy does exist and the city he went to. So if we can ascribe that these people were real people, what were they describing in perhaps the language that they were that they had at the time? I find it so rich.
Yeah, sea people, maybe.
Sea people.
I mean, there's lots of toing and froing going on. Could they just be like another way of describing another group of people? I don't know.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? I could see Caroline get a bit itchy in the back there. She's reading down the questions. So Caroline, how about you jump in here and perhaps share some stories from our questions and answers, and jump in with your own.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. Again, Mike, thank you very much. Moving along to the questions, Mike. First is from me, actually. It says, there's really a rich amount of anomalous phenomena in Wales. Why do you think that is? What's the reason behind it?
Yeah, there's this I think there's a westernness, isn't there? Like, you know yourself, the west of England's often got an association more with the strange, and I suppose it just, Cornwall and other places too, it just adds that Celticity to it as well. I think the Mabinogion tales play their part. But I think again, from the beginning of the 20th century, the 1930s, there's more interest in Welsh. There's more acceptance of the legendary element of Wales, so maybe a bit more was made of that. But I think we could go into high strange explanations and the like. Geological formations people throw out sometimes, possibly as reasons. The Celtic mind, the Celtic eye, those kind of things too. So I think we can go from quite practical suggestions of it's more likely to last in a place that is less, how can you describe it, urban or metropolitan perhaps, to ones that are quite magical, literally.
So I know that you just touched on mindset. Do you think that if it's a mindset of somebody believing in folklore and having been brought up with a rich history of folklore, it tends to lead to people to experience more?
Well, I thinking back to some of my own family that live in parts of rural Wales, there was an openness to it, even if they were, had other belief systems, even if they're quite modern mentalities, or if they were religious, they still have that element of like respecting the hair, don't harm the hair. But if you see a snake, kill it quick, kind of thing. Yeah, so you would see it in a rural environment. Again, that plays an important part too.
I remember there's a tale local to Dorset that's been told that you're not allowed to mention hare or rabbit on Portland. But that wasn't for superstitious reasons to do with folklore. It was to do with the fact that a lot of the miners were killed in the quarry because the rabbits were digging out the holes, and obviously the quarry caved in. Wow. So yeah, animals are blamed for a lot of stuff in folklore and for history. I get that, but don't diss the rabbits and the hares. Definitely not. Moving on to my next comment. I loved your headless horse picture. And when we collaborate on our article that we're currently doing, can you do the pictures for us for that as well for Haunted Magazine?
That was very rudimentary, but I just managed to remove the head and replace it with some foliage from the back.
It was perfect. It was perfect. Oh, well, Gave me a giggle on a Thursday. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kristian says, How much of Ceredigon's high strangeness folklore has been preserved through oral traditions versus written accounts?
Right, yeah, that's a very good question. And I'd just like to add, you reminded me there that I left out the two weirdest things simply because of